Estonia, a country on the intersection of Eastern and Northern Europe, bordering the Baltic Sea with a population of over 1 million people, and Oscar. So, how did all these people get here? I mean, when and how did their ancestors arrive in Estonia thousands of years ago? A decade ago it would be impossible to tell, but now thanks to developments in science we can give some insight into the genetic history of ethnic Estonians. It has been established that 90% of Estonians have patrilineally descended from one of these 5 men who lived more than 20,000 years ago. These men are important because they were the founders of great tribes. Scientists have given them these classifications, but in order to make the story easier to follow, we made up our own names for these guys. Their successors didn't come to Estonia at the same time. They arrived at different times for different reasons, and now we'll take a closer look at how their successors made it to Estonia. Our story begins at the end of the last ice age. Northern Europe was under a shield of ice, and a big part of the continent was covered with uninhabited tundra. People had fled to the southern parts of Europe and to the Middle East, where they had to endure a cold climate for millennia. That's when Aitor, Dagda and Aras were born. Aitor was born on the Balkan Peninsula, Dagda and Aras in the mid-Eurasia. The latter two shared a common forefather and originated from the same tribe, but they went on to found their own separate tribes. The descendants of these men were the first to reach Estonia. How did it happen? At one point the climate started to warm up and the ice began to recede. Now, suddenly in front of them, the hunters-gatherers found an uninhabited land with plentiful game, and they started migrating north. The ice receded from Estonia 11,000 years ago, and people settled in soon after that. Were the first human inhabitants in Estonia the descendants of Aitor, Aras or Dagda, or did they come from another tribe? We can't be sure. We do know, however, that Aitor's descendants were in the Baltics at least 6,500 years ago, Dagda's descendants 7,500 years ago, and Aras's descendants at least 6,000 years ago. It took a long time before a new wave of migration hit Estonia. These migrants were also the descendants of Aras. However, they were very different from the ones who had already lived in this region. What happened to them in the meantime? The thing is, not all the descendants of Dagda and Aras went north at the beginning. Some of them had settled to the Pontic steppe and became later known as the Indo-Europeans. There they domesticated horses, started using bronze tools and began cultivating land. These innovations gave the Indo-Europeans great advantages, and 5,000 to 6,000 years ago they started expanding rapidly and their population began to thrive. As a result, their descendants are the most numerous among present-day Europeans. Their language was the foundation to most of the modern European languages. Dagda's descendants moved for the most part to Western Europe, and Aras's descendants among other places populated Eastern Europe and reached Estonia a little less than 5,000 years ago. With them, they brought agriculture. This gave them a great advantage against the local hunters and gatherers, because it enabled them to gain more food from the same area. Aras's descendants multiplied rapidly and they began to form the bulk of the Estonian inhabitants. Finally, even the hunters-gatherers started cultivating land. The fourth forefather of Estonians, Kalev, was born in the Far East about 15,500 years ago. Later, his descendants migrated west and north. Some of them settled down in the southern region of the Ural Mountains. There, a man was born to the Kalev lineage. As he was one of the great-grandsons of Kalev, we shall call him the son of Kalev, or Kalevipoeg in Estonian. His tribe gained a strong footing of its own and started spreading out. The descendants of Kalevipoeg populated a large part of northern Eurasia. Today his descendants populate the lands from Chukotka to Norway. Some of them migrated west and settled down at the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. As people in the regions where Kalevipoeg's descendants live speak Finno-Ugric languages, it is believed that Kalevipoeg was a Finno-Ugrian. This means that the modern Estonian language developed from a language that Kalevipoeg once spoke. The exact time of Kalevipoeg's descendants' migration hasn't been determined, and scientists are still working on it. Ragnar, the fifth forefather of Estonians, was probably born in Central Europe 5,000 years ago. His tribe had been living in Europe at least since the end of the Ice Age. Ragnar's descendants were driven away to Scandinavia by other tribes, which at the time was populated by hunters-gatherers. As Ragnar's descendants were agriculturists, they multiplied rapidly and became dominant in Scandinavia. Later on, Scandinavians started dispersing, and thus a large number of Ragnar's descendants ended up in Estonia. Aitor and Takta were here first, but the subsequent migrations reduced their numbers significantly. As a result, only 3% of Estonians are the direct descendants of Aitor, and 9% the descendants of Takta. The number of Aras's descendants was boosted by agriculture, which is the reason 33% of Estonians descend from him. Kalev's tribe was the last to reach Estonia, and his direct descendants make up at least 31% of ethnic Estonians. And due to a major influx of Ragnar's descendants, there are around 15% of them among Estonians.